There's a question which we have mentioned. If the physical world is finite and its material and its makeup is material, how does one take and do a physical act which activates spiritual forces which touch upon the infinite, which have no limitation? That's a question. We speak about the value of a mitzvah. Chazal tell us, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that the innate value of the study of Torah is the equivalent of all the commandments combined. The energy which the study of Torah generates is the equivalent of 613 commandments. And we had mentioned name of the Vilna Gaon that when we say the study of Torah is the equivalent of all the commandments combined, that's the level of spiritual energy that it generates. We're speaking about every word of the Torah that's studied activates that degree of our energy. How does this happen? You say a word. The word itself is articulated by a human being. If the Jew says that word, and if a person is not a Jew says that same word, does it activate the same force? The answer is definitely not. First, a Jew is obligated to study the Torah, to articulate those words, to delve and toil over the meaning of those words, besides living one's life as God dictates that we must. But the actual words themselves, when it's expressed and articulated or meditated by a Jew, it has a totally different dimension of ramification than by a non-Jew. A woman is not obligated to study the Torah. If a woman studies the Torah, does it generate the same energy level as when a man studies the Torah? The Talmud tells us that greater is the one who must fulfill the obligation, one who is obligated, than one who's not obligated. Although logically you would think something that you must do, you have no choice. And therefore, the value of what you must do, because you have no choice, has less value. But the person who's not obligated, such as the woman, when she studies Torah, since she's not obligated, and despite her non-obligation, she chooses to study, you would say it has greater value. But the Talmud concludes just to the contrary, that greater is the one who's obligated to fulfill the commandment than the one who's not obligated. What exactly is the rationale? Two things. We read in Pirkei Avos, Lefum Tzara Agro, that the greater the challenge in regard to any service of God, the greater is the value if one succeeds despite the challenge. Why? Because as difficult as it may be, if the person nevertheless succeeds despite every level of discouragement and the difficulty, that indicates a greater degree of dedication. You're fully committed, you're fully dedicated, you're fully subservient to the master's will. Now, there is such a thing as an evil inclination. The evil inclination is a force, an angel that was created to trip us up, to cause us to see things which are the ultimate in spiritual value as detrimental to our life, or not to appreciate its value, to discourage us from doing it. And the material has greater value. Even areas within the material realm, which are transgressions, and we crave those areas. That's due to the evil inclination. If you're not challenged, if you're not obligated, there's no challenge. So the person who's obligated, that is the one who the evil inclination focuses on, that the person should not succeed, should not fulfill. The one who's not obligated, because that person has no obligation, the evil inclination doesn't in any way interfere with that person fulfilling that area, because it's not an area of responsibility. This is how some of the commentators explain why greater is the one who's obligated to fulfill than the one who's not obligated to fulfill that particular obligation. But what is really the understanding? So Rav Aaron Kotler, Zecher Tzadik Levrach, explains that, I'll give you an example. A person is fully healthy and his pancreas produces enough insulin to break down whatever carbohydrates, whatever sugars are in the body. So if that person would take insulin, not only may it be not beneficial, it's not beneficial, it may even be detrimental. But the person who needs that insulin, the insulin is necessary for his processing of various chemistries within his body to break down the foods, so his body should be able to tolerate and benefit from whatever that food may be. A person who's obligated to fulfill a mitzvah, why did God obligate that particular person in that area? For instance, a man has an obligation, as we mentioned yesterday, to study Torah. A woman has no obligation. A man has an obligation, is bound that even positive commandments, which are time determined, like the Shema, it's time determined. You can only say it during certain times of the day. Sitting in the sukkah, it's only the specific time of the year. The lulav, specific time during the year and only certain time of the day. Fringes on the four corners of your garment. It's a day obligation, not a night obligation. A woman is not obligated to any of this. A man is obligated. Why? The answer is the reason why God gave us the positive commandments is only to address the deficiencies in our soul that have to be infused with this spiritual energy to allow it to develop into a complete level, to advance it to a full level, a complete level, a perfected level. The woman's soul who does not need that level of perfection, it's totally superfluous. It may have some value. It's like a healthy person taking a vitamin. It's maybe healthier, but a person who's truly unhealthy, the vitamins more than make him healthier, it's to make the person healthy. So the male, whose soul is in need of these various infusions of spirituality, therefore these commandments, positive commandments, are given to them, to the man, to the male, because he's in need of it. The woman who's not in need of it, therefore it has some value, but it doesn't have that same level of value. Therefore, greater is the one who's commanded, because the only reason why you are commanded is because you need it. It's like a doctor writing a prescription. He writes the prescription to the person he's in need of the antibiotic. He's not going to write the prescription to the one who doesn't need the antibiotic to contend whatever that issue may be, because that person doesn't have that issue. Therefore, as greater is the one who's obligated to fulfill than the one, because the end result is not only beneficial, it's necessary for that person. Therefore, the end result has greater value than the one who doesn't need it, who's not commanded. But again, because we're in need of that, that's what the evil inclination wants to deny us, that spiritual infusion which brings about spiritual perfection. He doesn't want you to perfect yourself, because that is its value. The woman who has no obligation to study Torah in many of these areas, the woman, because she has no need, it's not necessary to discourage her, because that infusion is not necessary. So really one is linked to the other. Where you need, because you're commanded, you're in need. because you're in need to develop yourself into advantage of spiritually speaking, he doesn't allow you, because the end result is spiritual perfection. The woman who's not in need, so the end result is not spiritual perfection, because that area of her spirituality is already complete. If she does, she doesn't, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Therefore, there's no discouragement. Therefore, it's easier for the woman to fill those obligations, which are not obligations to her, those commandments, than for the man. This is the idea. Now, because the soul is in need of certain actions or certain involvements or certain orientation, God linked the action that when you do that action, it generates a certain energy. I'll give you an example. The Talmud tells us, for instance, we know that in existence, there are certain materials which are flammable and certain materials which are not flammable. Certain materials are combustible, certain are not combustible. Certain materials have density, a certain level, others don't have that same density. Water extinguishes fire. Water and fire cannot coexist. Why can't they coexist? Because in terms of what fire is and what the way God created existence, in terms of its makeup, liquid extinguishes fire. But if you take gasoline and you put it on fire, although it's liquid, you can create a conflagration of the fire by adding that other liquid. Has to be a certain type of liquid which will extinguish the fire. But why? The answer is because God says, in terms of its molecular makeup and structure, that's how they interact or they don't interact. That's the reality. During the plague of hail, what happened? It was ice and fire coexisted simultaneously. Pharaoh initially, he rejected everything Moshe represented. He said it's all witchcraft. But when it came to the plague of hail, he immediately, it wasn't because it was so devastating. He believed the end was coming. He says, God is the tzaddik, and I and my people are evil. Why was it such an eye-opener? Because the plague of hail was fire and water coexisting, which is out of the realm of nature. All the other plagues were an increase. Frogs, lice, earth became lice. Okay. But how do you take two entities which are contradictory entities, and how could they coexist? The answer is because whatever anything is, it's only because God wills it should be that. And the example is with a story in the Talmud, which I mentioned in the past, where Reb Chanina Mendoza, his daughter didn't have oil to light the Shabbos candles. And she only had a flask of vinegar. And he saw she was a little down because she had nothing to light the candles. So he says, what's the problem? It's not a problem. As God decrees that oil should burn, God could decree that vinegar should burn. He says, why don't you try it? She put the wick in the vinegar, and sure enough, the vinegar burned like oil. Not only did it burn like oil, that flask of vinegar, which volume-wise was no more than the oil, lasted until after Shabbos that they used that light for Havdalah. But how? How does it happen? Vinegar is not combustible. It's not flammable. It's not supposed to burn. But why doesn't it burn? Because the energies which are released, which allow it to manifest itself in the physical, that the end result should be that, God just changes the model. He just changes the molecular structure of whatever it is, but all that's based on energies. Everything we do is only a manifestation of forces which evolve into the physical. So the physical is linked to the spiritual. God says every word of the Torah is linked to the spiritual realm. And when the human being mouths that word activates something in the spiritual realm. If God wouldn't have linked that word to that energy level, it's just saying the word. It'd be like a parrot, parroting words. It means nothing. But because the Jew possesses a soul, a multi-dimensional soul, which the non-Jewish soul doesn't have the same spiritual makeup. When the Jew says that word, it's like, a person has a booster rocket, or you have an engine, which is the engine in F-25, 26, and it can fly, and it has power, there's nothing compared to that power. The Jewish soul is the mega power. It's a mega soul. That soul, when it engages in what it's supposed to engage in, it activates forces which are unimaginable, which surpass all existence. But it's only because God made that linkage. If he wouldn't have made the linkage, it wouldn't happen. When you put on tefillin, when you wear tzitzis, because the soul is in need of that, God says when you do that physical action, everything in the physical is only a symbolism of something in the spiritual realm. I once asked the question, the Talmud tells us that anything which is weighed, measured, or counted has no relevance to blessing. Blessing cannot come upon it. For instance, if a person goes and he brings in this harvest and he evaluates this harvest, 10,000 bushels of wheat, counts the bushels, and then he supplicates God, it should be the will of God that blessing should come upon my harvest. The Talmud says it's a supplication in vain, has no value. But before the person goes and makes the evaluation that he has 10,000 bushels of wheat, and before he actually makes that evaluation, he prays to God that blessing should come upon his harvest, it's a valid supplication. Why? So the Talmud says, based on a verse in the Torah, that blessing only comes upon something which is concealed from the eye, something that's quantified, something which is known, weighed, measured, or counted. Blessing cannot come upon that. The question is why? So the Maharal of Prague explains that what is the concept of blessing? Blessing is a spiritual concept. He says, for instance, if you say to a person, could you give me a blessing? And you say to a person, you should be blessed. To what degree? The person says, you should be blessed. Blessing has a connotation of unlimited. Anything which is unlimited is outside the realm of physicality. It's beyond finite. So if blessing is something innately spiritual, which is unlimited, so it only has relevance to something which is within the same realm. It has to be within the spiritual realm. Once you count, you measure, or you weigh something, you've given it a finite characteristic. Finite has no relevance to unlimited. Therefore, blessing has no relevance to something which once it's quantified by counting, measuring, or weighing it. That's how the Maharal explains the statement in the Talmud that blessing only comes upon something which is unknown, which is concealed from the eye. Because once it's quantified, it becomes finite. Finite is a physical characteristic. Now, so there's a question which I once asked. What was the holiest location on earth? The Mishkan. God said, make for me a Mishkan, the sanctuary, and I will dwell in your midst. And all blessing emanates from there. What is the Bishkon? The Bishkon, if you read about its vessels, its parts, it was made with a specification was so exact that if you did not meet the specifications that was prescribed, it's not valid. Every one of them, whether it's the vertical beams, whether it's the materials, everything had to be made exactly to specification. And it's very specific. It's very finite. God is an infinite being, the ultimate, an absolute infinite. And yet God says, make for me that domicile, that sanctuary, I will dwell in your midst. Now, how is God supposed to dwell? Dwells the ultimate and spiritual. And here we have something which is quantified on the most exact finite level. God dwells in that midst, in that location. How's it possible? It's contrary to the whole concept we just mentioned. So what's the answer? The answer is obvious. The Bishkon itself, when you weigh, you count bushels of wheat. What is the innate value of a bushel of wheat? The innate value of a bushel of wheat is a bushel of wheat. So by counting it, weighing it, or measuring it, you've actually quantified what you have. When you build the Bishkon, whether it's the laver, whether it's the altar, whether it's the ark, whatever it is, what is it? It's a representation of something which represents the infinite. These are symbolisms. That's all they are. You measure a piece of property, that's the property. You weigh something, it's what you weigh. You count something, it's what you count. As a result of that, once you give it that physical characteristic, it has no relevance to blessing. But something which is made to specification, and the specification of whatever it is has nothing to do with what it is in terms of its physicality. But these are all representations of something which is of the unknown. Therefore, it's not contradictory to this concept. And only God knows its value. We say, schar bayal moleko. When a person does a mitzvah, the innate value of the mitzvah, the value that's generated, if you live 1,000 years and you take all the benefit of existence, you cannot be compensated for that one mitzvah. Doesn't make sense. You wear tzitzis for one moment. The Talmud tells us that if a child lives to the point where his aunt's just able to say the word Amen, which is an acronym for Kel Melech Nemon, on a blessing, that's all. His soul has a share in the world to come. But he only said Amen. And if you say Amen 90 times a day, and you say 100 blessings a day, and you put on tefillin, and you say Shema, you can't fathom the innate value of fulfilling one mitzvah. That's the level of energy it generates, which goes beyond this existence. And if you want to try to even touch upon, if you do multiple commandments, could you even relate to it? Schar ba'al maleka. You can't be rewarded in this world. It's not possible. Could you put more than an ounce into a cup that only has capacity to contain an ounce? Or a quart? Not possible. This world has a capacity. The capacity is all within the physical sense. Spirituality surpasses the parameters of this world. Therefore, this world has no relevance to be rewarded for doing a mitzvah. It's kept for the world to come. That's why reward cannot be. But why not? I just put tefillin, it's a little box. It has black straps. It's made of the hide of a kosher species. It has parchments, which is the parchment from a kosher species. The gut, it's the gut from a kosher species. It's all physical. It's symbolisms. It's like the Mishkan. How could that domicile contain God's presence if God is infinite, but somehow he dwells there? Because what that represents, we have no understanding what that represents. The example I always give, you have the Hope Diamond, and you have 1,000 trailers loaded with steel, with iron. Quantitatively, 1,000 trailers loaded with iron is a lot more than this, relatively speaking, this little stone, which you call a diamond. But innate value, they're not comparable. You cannot compare the value of that diamond to 1,000 truckloads of this iron, or maybe even more than that. because it has a certain innate value, which the other doesn't have. God constructed every aspect of our spirituality. Only God knows the makeup of our soul. You can't make a laboratory test to understand what's beneficial, what's detrimental to our spirituality. Only God knows. God says this commandment is beneficial. Crossing this line is detrimental. How detrimental? Only God knows. It's based on multiple things. What is it fused with? Positive or negative? Is it inadvertent? Is it deliberate? Is it defiant? When you do the positive, do you do it for the sake of God? Do you do it selflessly? Do you do it out of reverence? Do you do it out of love? All these various added associations with doing the will of God activates another level of energy, brings it to another level. But why? Because that's innate in whatever God created, because God linked and he constructed that. Could you imagine? You could have something no larger than a fingernail, and you could put on that chip millions of pieces of information. Could you imagine that? Going back 50 years ago, it's not imaginable. Whoever heard of such a thing? But it's possible. So if the human being could take something so minute, so small, and put all this endless information on this barely visible chip, so God can't say, you see this little box, which is called tefillin, contain this tefillin, it activates forces that you can't imagine. Doesn't make sense. Yeah, but the other thing does make sense. As they say, ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is foolishness. But the more you understand, the more you understand what you don't understand. And it's beyond our grasp. And that's what it's all about. And that's exactly, God constructed this physical existence that in terms of its innateness, it has value if you actually engage with it properly. And if you don't engage with it properly, you can desecrate it, you can destroy it, and you can destroy something which has infinite value. So how do you know exactly how to gauge what is and what's not? You got to read the instruction manual. You need mentoring. Any expert in any field is mentored. He takes an apprenticeship. The Torah itself is based on tradition. It's passed down from generation to generation. And the teacher, not only does he have to be knowledgeable, it has to be a combination of knowledge, but that knowledge only has a special value if it's coupled with reverence and love of God. Then that information takes on a new level of value. You will never find in the history of the Jewish people a Torah sage who was not, in addition to his Torah knowledge, that he was devout and holy and pious. It goes hand in hand. You may find Torah scholars, what that means, scholars. But those Torah scholars, they may have a tremendous trove of information, but do they have relevance to the truth of Torah? No relevance to the truth of Torah. Because to be worthy and privileged to come upon the truth of Torah, you have to have relevance with the truth, which is God himself, which, as the Talmud tells us, God's signet is truth. So if you have relevance, a relationship with God, which is rooted in belief and in reverence and in love, then you have relevance to truth. And if you have relevance to truth, God shares and allows you to come upon his truth, which is the absolute truth, which is innately contained within the Torah itself. We're going to stop here today. We'll continue tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
1 second.